Right. So I'll start my introduction today as people are joining the call. So thank you all for joining us today for the webinar, The Conduct and Response of Third States to Gaza, with former Canadian Ambassador to Israel and Senior Fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History, Jon Allen. My name is Megan Reed, and I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Zoryan Institute, and I will be the moderator for today's session. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the Zoryan Institute is a nonprofit organization that is dedicated to raising awareness on issues relating to genocide, human rights, and diaspora homeland relations through research, scholarship, and education. Founded in 1982, the Institute is known for its oral history collections and archives, scholarly publications, international conferences, its annual graduate level university program, two peer-reviewed academic journals, and more recently, its online educational programming, such as podcasts, teaching tools, and webinars like the one we're hosting today. Since October 7th, 2023, third states, meaning any state that is not part to a specific agreement or international convention in question, have been facing international pressure to respond to the escalating violence and address the humanitarian crisis that is unfolding in Gaza. This session today will provide timely insight into the motivations and consequences behind their conduct by including the reaction of the Biden and Trump administrations, the Canadian and European governments, and other major powers, including India, China, and Russia. At the end of today's session, we'll be allocating 20 minutes or so for a brief Q&A with Jon Allen. We kindly ask that you send all your questions through the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen. Or you could also raise your hand as well, and we can address questions at the end of today's session. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Jon Allen, with a brief bio. Jon Allen joined the Canadian Department of External Affairs in 1981. In addition to postings abroad in Mexico City and New Delhi, Mr. Allen has held positions of Minister of Political Affairs at the Canadian Embassy in Washington, Assistant Deputy Minister for the Americas, and he served as Canada's ambassador to Israel from 2012 to 2016, and he was sorry, my apologies. Served as Canada's ambassador to Israel from 2006 to 2010, and ambassador to Spain and Andorra from 2012 to 2016. He is currently senior fellow at the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History and chair of the Rosanna Canada, a nonprofit whose objective is to build bridges between Palestinians and Israelis through the health sector. Mr. Allen, thank you so much for joining us today for our session, and I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Megan. Thanks to the Zoryan Institute and to Greg for the opportunity to discuss the world's reactions to the war in Gaza with all of you today. During the Q&A, which is generally one of the best parts of these conversations, I'm happy to discuss briefly the international community's reactions to the Israeli and US attacks on Iran as well. But we've got lots to talk about here now. I would begin by, before discussing the responses to the war in Gaza, though, I thought it was important to see how the world reacted initially to the Hamas attacks on the kibbutzim in southern Israel and at the Nova Music Festival on October 7, the event that obviously precipitated the conflict that we're witnessing almost 21 months after October 7. Led by the US and President Biden, and joined by Canada and all EU member states, the West and some others, including in particular Mexico and Argentina, strongly condemned the massacre of innocent women and children and the taking of some 200 hostages on October the 7th. All leaders of the G7, except for Justin Trudeau, traveled to Israel to express their condolences, to condemn Hamas's actions, and stated their support for Israel's right to self-defense. In an effort to warn off Israel's neighbors, Iran, Hezbollah, and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq, Yemen, and Syria from joining in the conflict, the U.S. sent aircraft carriers, fighter planes, and significant amounts of both offensive and defensive weapons to Israel. The UK and Germany also provided weapons. Many countries in the global south, however, including, for example, South Africa, Turkey, and the Gulf states, and many others, while condemning the attack, sought to locate it within the broader context of the continuing Israeli occupation of Gaza and in the West Bank. Most countries urged restraint, but expressed concern for the loss of innocent lives. Although comments by various Israeli politicians, senior military officers, and even the president suggested that not only Hamas, but all Gazans might be going to pay a price for October 7, the Americans from the outset warned Israel against a full-scale war that would inevitably result in thousands of civilian deaths and injured. The U.S. cited its own failures in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where their actions led to thousands of civilian deaths and injured, alienated the local populations, and spawned the likes of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Unfortunately, Israel paid little heed to these U.S. warnings, and the death and the devastation that began, as I said, over 20 months ago, has continued without, I would say, until recently, serious public criticism by Western states. So what has the international community's response to the war looked like? The Biden administration, which provided Israel with over $18 billion in extra military and other assistance from the beginning of the war until the end of its term in January 2025, publicly criticized Israel basically regarding two of its policies. The first was Israel's refusal on various occasions, an initial siege and subsequent very limited flows, to permit reasonable amounts of humanitarian assistance into Gaza. You may recall that while Jordan and other countries were airdropping supplies, the U.S. actually spent some $350 million to build a pier from which they hoped to offload food, medicines, and water. It was unfortunately an abject failure, much like the current efforts by the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is another failure by the U.S. and Israel to deliver assistance. Secondly, the Biden administration announced that the U.S. was refusing to send a shipment of 2,000-pound bombs to Israel when the government there decided to move all Gazans into an area close to the Rafah crossing in the south, but not cease its bombing campaign. This decision was publicly criticized by Prime Minister Netanyahu and by Republicans in Congress, an outrageous response essentially given all that the Biden administration and Biden personally had done for Israel up to that point. I just wanted to mention here the challenges facing Palestinians in the U.S., especially in Michigan, where a majority live, as the U.S. election approached in the fall of 2024. While Palestinians were understandably disappointed in the Biden administration's unswerving support for Israel, their decision to either stay home on election day or to vote for Trump, as some did, was, in my view, completely contrary to their long-term interests. Trump is, after all, the president who recognized Jerusalem as capital of Israel, contrary to leaving that as one of the final status issues to be determined in a negotiation. He's the president that recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights, who called for the deportation of Palestinians from Gaza, and also appointed 2 successive U.S. ambassadors to Israel who support annexation of the West Bank. Let me turn briefly to the Trump administration's response to October 7 and his overriding preoccupation, which is, in my view, not the lives and the future of Palestinians in Gaza, nor in the West Bank, nor has it been the release of the hostages, except perhaps for hostages with U.S. citizenship, and more recently as he tries to force a ceasefire. Rather, Trump's goals are to fulfill his failed promise of ending the war on day one, and his other goal is ultimately to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Talk about ironies of irony when last night an individual who has an arrest warrant issued for him by the International Criminal Court for alleged war crimes nominates a man for the Nobel Peace Prize who is in the process of deporting legal immigrants in the U.S. to places of clear danger to them. To give Trump his due, he and his Mideast and rest of the world peace envoy Steve Witkoff did follow up on the Biden negotiated ceasefire and did succeed in halting the bombings and obtaining the release of several hostages and Palestinian prisoners. That held until Prime Minister Netanyahu breached the agreement and resumed the war. Ultimately, Netanyahu wouldn't agree to a permanent ceasefire because of pressure on him from his 2 far-right ministers and coalition partners who threatened to quit that coalition if the IDF didn't resume fighting in Gaza. Ironically, we're back in very similar circumstances right now as Trump tries to pressure Netanyahu to accept another temporary ceasefire and then hopefully a final peace deal. So how did other countries respond to almost 21 months of war that has led to some 56,000 deaths, possibly 35,000 who were civilians, over 100,000 injured, and the destruction of approximately 60% of the Gaza Strip? Of the major powers, Russia and China have consistently criticized Israel's actions. Russia, a former quiet but important ally of Israel, that, for example, allowed Israeli fighter planes to attack Iranian weapons shipments in Syria, which were on their way to Hezbollah and Hamas, Russia quickly turned on Israel. It described Israel's actions as indiscriminate and flagrant violations of international law. Talk about the pot calling the frying pan black. Its abandonment of Israel was further confirmed when Russia began purchasing Iranian drones for its war against Ukraine. China, which had prior to October 7 purchased the port of Haifa in Israel and was increasing its investments and trade with Israel in a big way, has also been critical both of the humanitarian crisis and of the use of collective punishment by Israel. India, on the other hand, now led by the virulently pro-Hindu, anti-Muslim Prime Minister Narendra Modi, has been far more muted in its criticism and has staunchly defended Israel's right to defend itself. Unsurprisingly, the Gulf states have been publicly highly critical of Israel on all fronts. The so-called street in Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and other Gulf states is strongly pro-Palestinian and opposed to the war, to the occupation, and to settlement expansion in the West Bank. The Gulf states, Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon were, for example, among the most vocal critics of Trump's deportation proposal. However, when it comes to taking concrete actions to oppose Israeli war efforts, the Gulf states' responses have been almost non-existent. None of the members of the Abraham Accords, the UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, or Sudan, withdrew ambassadors or broke off diplomatic relations. Qatar, for its part, has, along with Egypt, continued to play a key role in representing Hamas in the efforts to reach a ceasefire, but only Jordan, which has a very significant Palestinian population, withdrew its ambassador in protest, in particular, of the humanitarian crisis. The one country that stands out in its opposition is Saudi Arabia. The King and the Crown Prince, MBS, continue to refuse to enhance diplomatic relations with Israel or to join either the Abraham Accords or to sign a Saudi, US, Israel economic, security, and defense agreement unless and until Israel ends the war and agrees to a pathway towards a Palestinian state. So now let's take a quick look at how the West, that's the EU, the Nordics, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, have responded to the war. Up until fairly recently, the Western countries that were most critical of Israel's actions were those that had previously recognized Palestine as a state. These included Spain, Ireland, and Norway. And although Belgium has not yet recognized Palestine, it too has been highly critical of Israel's actions. For example, Spain called Israel's actions in Gaza disproportionate, questioned whether Israel is complying with international humanitarian law, and supported the International Criminal Court's indictment of Israel's Prime Minister and its former Minister of Defense. Ireland condemned Israel's humanitarian blockade as a war crime. Its Prime Minister referred to Gaza as hell on earth, and Ireland intervened to support South Africa's case against Israel under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice. In response, Israel closed its embassy in Dublin. Similarly, Norway has been a consistent proponent of an unconditional ceasefire and repeatedly called for Israel to respect international law and humanitarian access. Its foreign minister described Israeli airstrikes in Rafah as catastrophic and completely unacceptable. Most other countries in the EU, save for Hungary, Czechia, and Slovakia, which are the most supportive of Israel, most others have all called for increased humanitarian aid and a ceasefire. Recently, Canada, the UK, and France issued a statement in which they were highly critical of the humanitarian situation. A complete siege had been in place for 11 weeks at the time, and of the indiscriminate bombing leading to civilian deaths and injuries. The statement also criticized the expansion of settlements in the West Bank, the threats to remove Palestinians from Gaza, and the efforts to annex the West Bank. The three countries warned of further actions if Israel did not respond positively. Subsequently, after Israel announced the expansion of 22 new settlements in the West Bank, and we witnessed increased settler violence there with little improvement in the humanitarian situation in Gaza, Canada joined again with the UK, and this time with Australia and New Zealand, to repeat its criticisms, but this time to impose sanctions on two Israeli far-right ministers, Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich. Both those ministers had advocated for the removal of Palestinians from Gaza and for the resettlement by Israelis there. Both openly support annexation of the West Bank and have, by their inaction and their statements, supported settler violence against Palestinians. and both have opposed a ceasefire in Gaza, as I mentioned, and have prioritized eliminating Hamas over the release of the remaining Israeli hostages. Israel responded to these statements by suggesting that they were tantamount to expressing support for Hamas. Prime Minister Netanyahu even suggested that the trilateral statement that Canada signed contributed to the tragic murders of 2 Israeli embassy employees in Washington that occurred a few days after the statement was issued. Finally, we can have a look at what the United Nations has said and done in response to the war. Both the Secretary General and various UN bodies, from those on the ground, including UNRWA, the WHO, and UNICEF, and those human rights bodies in Geneva, have been highly critical of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and, of course, the attacks on civilian populations in Israel's effort to, quote, eliminate, unquote, Hamas. Several of the UN's own employees have been killed or injured, as have a significant number of journalists and civilians working for NGOs in the Gaza Strip. While the Security Council did adopt 2 resolutions during Biden's tenure calling for increased humanitarian assistance and pauses in the fighting to allow for that assistance to be delivered, any Security Council resolutions condemning Israel's use of force in Gaza have been vetoed by the US, both by the Biden and now the Trump administrations. So in summary, I would say first that only the US has real influence over Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Joe Biden's combination of delivering weapons and criticizing Israel for its indiscriminate bombing and restrictions on the humanitarian aid did little, frankly, to temper Israel's activities in Gaza. Donald Trump's entry onto the scene at first brought some hope that his personal ambition and leverage over Israel might lead to positive results, both for Palestinians and for the hostages remaining in Gaza. Unfortunately, Netanyahu chose, as I said, his coalition over the hostages, broke that ceasefire, imposed an 11-week siege, and Trump blinked. We will see what Trump's latest push for a ceasefire brings as Steve Witkoff heads to Qatar this week to try and include another temporary ceasefire. My second point is that while the West's influence over Israel may not be as great as the US's, it nonetheless had an obligation to be far more critical of Israel's actions far earlier in the war. All Western countries, including, of course, Germany, which clearly has an ambivalent relationship with Israel for obvious reasons, have traditionally been loath to criticize Israel, given its dangerous neighborhood, its past wars with its neighbors, the Second Intifada, and the importance of Jewish diasporas in their countries. The horrific nature of the October 7 attacks also made Western leaders pause before beginning to criticize Israel's response. That likely accounted for the relatively muted criticism initially. But after months of relentless bombing, an Israeli-imposed humanitarian crisis, and a massive, by any standard, number of deaths and injuries in Gaza, as well as a brewing crisis in the West Bank, where settler violence runs rampant, there is no longer any excuse for silence among the international community, especially the West, which claims to have high regard for the principles of international humanitarian law. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to take your questions, and I look forward to to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. As mentioned before, you can add your questions to the Q&A chat box at the bottom of your screen, or you can use the raise your hand function and ask your questions out loud, and I will unmute you if you have any questions. Okay, our first one, we have thank you for your presentation, Mr. Allen. I noticed you consistently refer to the situation in Gaza as a war or a humanitarian crisis. Given the extensive documentation and legal analysis by UN experts and the numerous human rights organizations that describe it as genocide, with evidence arguably clearer than in many past atrocities, could you explain why you choose to frame it as a war rather than a genocide?
I refuse to talk about genocide at this point because I'm waiting for the International Court of Justice to rule on it. You've heard from Bill Shabas and others. I've never had a problem describing war crimes and crimes against humanity. As you know, and as the Zoryan Institute knows, genocide has a specific definition. It has a legal definition, whether in the Genocide Convention and otherwise in the statute of the International Criminal Court. And I really think it's up to the courts to decide. There are differing opinions. Philippe Sands, for example, is one who has said, war crimes and crimes against humanity are awful things that have been condemned, for generations, obviously since the Second World War. Genocide is another step in that direction. And I think that we'll see what the International Court says, whether there is intent to wipe out all or part of a people, of Palestinians. But I'm not yet ready to go there. And I don't actually think it's necessary to go there. I think it's important to recognize that war crimes and crimes against humanity have been committed, are being committed, that it should stop, that adding the genocide crime is not going to change that. And we'll see what the court says.
Thank you. We have another question from Professor William Shabas. He says, John, what is the state of play with respect to Canada's recognition of Palestine?
Well, there was a House of Commons Foreign Affairs and International Assistance Committee that was struck by the Liberal government, the past Liberal government of Justin Trudeau. They heard any number of witnesses, both pro and against. I testified before that committee myself and advocated for recognition of the state of Palestine. I'll note that, some people argue that there are certain conditions that have to be met, territorial integrity, ability to defend yourself, et cetera, et cetera. But the legal advisor of the Department of Global Affairs Canada, our Foreign Affairs Department, essentially stated that Canada can recognize any state at any time and doesn't have to follow any specific criteria set out in international law. I think what's really happening is that Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Belgium, the UK and France are all, they've all studied it. I don't think they have to study it anymore. 148 countries have already recognized the state of Palestine, including the three I mentioned from the EU. I think they're hesitant, probably because, they just want to set it within some kind of peace process that's moving forward. I think they're wrong. I think that it's time to remove Israel's veto from recognition of a Palestinian state. I think it's time to give the Palestinian people hope. that the Western countries, not just the other 148, are behind the self-determination of Palestinians. It's been the policy of all our governments for decades that there be a two-state solution. And I think it's important to signal, especially to Israel and to the United States, that ongoing settlement expansion and the type of policies being enunciated by Smotrich and Ben-Gvir and other right-wing ministers in the Israeli government has to stop, is unacceptable, and and that we have to move forward on that.
Thank you very much. We have another question here from Professor Alan Whitehorn. He says, do you see any analytical comparisons between Gaza today and the historic horrific conditions of the Warsaw Ghetto?
You know, I saw a statement today by the defense minister, Katz, which just frightened and shocked me. He is advocating a plan. It seems to be a version of the Trump plan. He's advocating that Palestinians will be moved from all parts of Gaza, especially from the north, into an area once again close to Rafah, that they will be security cleared, and that once they're in this area, they won't be allowed to leave. I mean, if that doesn't sound like the Warsaw Ghetto or a concentration camp, I don't know what does. And it just it's amazing that a minister in a government can be allowed to get away with that. It's ironic that the only government that's adopted the Trump plan for Riviera in Gaza, which Trump himself seems to have forgotten about, is Israel, who's actually engaged in planning for this. So that, of course, relates to the question about genocide, and if the court, which warned in its prima facie finding that Israel had to resist from any activities that even looked like genocide, then yeah, it's unbelievable. I note that there's an Israeli professor who's, I think, at either Sciences Po or Sorbonne, has done a paper on incitement to genocide. And incitement to genocide is one of the crimes in the Genocide Convention. And I think there's no question, given the statements, even by the president of Israel shortly after October 7, and by ministers and the chief of staff, former chief of staff, that incitement to genocide has taken place. So if that one's perhaps an easier one to find, and we'll see, as I said, what the court has to say.
Thank you so much. All right, are there any other questions that we haven't gotten to today? If so, you're welcome to raise your hand, and I'll give you another minute to add to the Q&A chat box as well. All right, well, thank you very much, Jon, for this incredible presentation today. It was so informative. And thank you for the participants for your questions today as well. We have recorded this session, so if any of you have missed any portion of this webinar or would like to rewatch it, we will have the recording available in the coming days on our website and on our YouTube channel. And we hope to see you at future Zoryan Institute events. Thank you, Jon, so much for your time and for your presentation today. Appreciate it.
Thanks very much, Megan. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care.